Welcome to the ultimate guide for dealing with fear, part 1. This is going to be a 2-part series where we're going to take a deep look into the nature of fear. Warning, this is an advanced teaching, an advanced episode, which means that a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about is going to go over the head of many people simply because you're probably going to need 5 or 10 years of basic self-help work before you can appreciate some of the stuff that I'll be saying here today. Now, of course, don't let that be an obstacle or a limiting belief for you. I mean, try to go through it anyways, try to understand it, because really, I'm not saying anything super complicated. It's just a matter of, are you mature enough to really appreciate what's being said and then to follow through on it and then to find it in your direct experience and to start to do the practices to make this a living reality for you. Anyways, though, you want to really make sure that you stick with me for part 2. A lot of you guys watch part 1, but then skip out on part 2. Part 2 is going to have a lot of important content in it. And to help you stick around, I'm going to promise you 2 things. Number 1 is that in part 2, I will give you the top 10 ways for overcoming fear and dealing with fear. Now, don't worry, though. We're still going to cover a lot of that material. We're going to build up to it here in part 1. So the part 1 is necessary to really understand what I'll be sharing in part 2. And then I'll also answer the following question for you. What is the most important quality that you need to succeed in life? What do you think? Take a guess. I'm going to give you the answer. It's going to be a one-word answer at the end of part 2. So stick around for that. Otherwise, let's just begin. So fear is not merely some psychological problem or some like psychological annoyance that you experience once in a while here and there. And it's also not merely a human problem. Fear has a very deep existential dimension. It's really a universal problem of consciousness. People don't appreciate that. It goes much deeper than just psychology. In fact, psychologists, scientists, and philosophers do not properly understand what fear is or why fear occurs. And this shows in our society because we don't teach fear. By which I mean we don't explain how it really works. We don't teach its existential dimensions. Notice that no one, through all of your years of schooling, and maybe you went to university, no one has ever taught you what fear is or how to deal with it. And yet, you've been dealing with fear through your own inadequate, inefficient ways. You've been trying to cope with it unconsciously for your entire life. Your entire life. Think back to your earliest memories of childhood, and I bet you'll find some of your earliest memories were memories of fear. You feared something, and that goes all the way up through till today. And yet nobody ever taught you how to deal with fear? Isn't that a scandal? Isn't that outrageous? And here we are in the 21st century. Mankind has been alive and, going strong for hundreds of thousands of years. But, modern civilization is maybe 5,000 years old, let's say. And nobody teaches you about fear? How can this be? This is an outrage. Well, of course, this shows you that there must be something deep to fear, that people are afraid to teach it. And we'll get into that in a minute. But really, people don't teach it because they themselves don't understand it. And you might wonder, well, how is it possible that scientists understand quantum mechanics and they understand gravity and they understand this advanced stuff, how to build supercomputers and semiconductors and all of this, and yet they don't understand fear? That's right. Hardly anybody in our society understands what fear is. Because our society is extremely materialistic, we don't put importance on the study of things like fear. Because fear is like, it's almost treated like this sort of like, oh, it's this little ancillary thing. It's this little thing that just kind of bugs you once in a while. It's almost like a phantom or a ghost that, it's unscientific. You can't even study it. What is fear? How do you quantify fear? How do you measure it fear? What are the units of fear? You see, this is the problem with science, is that science, in its attempt to quantify everything, becomes so autistic that it doesn't really have a handle on emotions, how emotions work. And therefore, of course, this isn't actually taught to you, even in fields like, excuse me, even in fields like psychology, where you would think, well, surely psychologists and therapists and psychoanalysts understand what fear is and how emotions really work. No, they don't. They don't. They themselves are full of fear. If you go to a therapist, your therapist will be full of fear and will not understand how fear really works, not at the deep level. So, of course, the reason I'm saying this is just to sort of prepare you for the fact that, some of the things you might hear here from me are going to be different than what you expected, or it might seem incredible at first, or it might seem like it contradicts what your religion taught you or what science taught you. Just be open to that, right? Because we're dealing with the challenge of overcoming the limitations of current culture. We're always dealing with that limitation in my work, in Actualized.org videos. We're always coming up against that because people always just assume that what their culture teaches them is the limits of human knowledge and is the truth. And then, of course, it's shocking to find out that nothing could be further from the truth. So the first thing you got to notice is that fear dominates your entire life. And this is an insight that I want to give credit to Peter Ralston for making me aware of this, of just how much fear dominates my life and all of our lives. It's not just something that happens. It's something that you're enmeshed in all the time. It's like you're a fish in water. You're a human in fear, living through fear, wading through fear, swimming through fear every single day of your life. So that shows you that this is something that's a little bit more serious than just an emotional problem. You're constantly afraid. Notice that. It might seem like, well, if I'm constantly afraid, Leo, then don't I already know it? No, you don't. That's the trick with emotions and with fear and with the way that consciousness works, is that the majority of your survival functions, the majority of your emotional system is outside of your awareness. It's like that old metaphor about the tip of the iceberg and the majority of the iceberg is submerged underwater. That's exactly how your emotions work, because your emotions are so fundamental that they aren't even allowed to enter your consciousness because they're so central to your survival. So even though you're completely dominated and run by fear, you're not really aware of why or how or what it is. It's controlling you like a marionette with strings, you see. You're at the effect of fear, but that does not mean you understand what fear is, nor does that mean that you have control over your fear. So let's start somewhere very fundamental, and let's just ask a few very fundamental existential questions. What is fear? Why is fear? What is the function of fear? Why does it exist at all? Why is it so pervasive and so constant? And why is it so difficult to just drop fear? Have you noticed that? Have you noticed that just a high quality argument, some logic, is not going to help you overcome a fear? Why is that? Well, fear is a self-control mechanism. It's not just some emotion. It's a core survival mechanism. It's the thing that keeps you alive, and it has saved your life literally many times since you were born. But it's not only that. It's not just that simple and black and white. See, fear is extremely sophisticated and elaborate. All of your emotions are. That's actually what makes emotions so challenging for science to study, is because they're not simple. You can't just run a little simple 1, 2, 3 experiment and understand emotions, because emotions, by their very nature, they're sneaky. They come in subtle gradations. They're phenomenological, or they're first person, they're subjective, they're experiential. This makes it very challenging to pinpoint what an emotion is, to nail it to the wall. to write it in the form of an equation. Even if you could write an equation for what fear is or for what anger is or happiness is, it wouldn't be good enough, because what ultimately matters with emotions is your ability to be conscious of them and to recognize them in your own subjective, personal, direct experience. Not what some science book tells you or what some equation tells you. The equation is not going to help you to get rid of your fear. Fear is there to help you to maintain whatever you identify with. That's the key insight. To maintain whatever you believe you are. And here I have to refer you to my two-part series of very foundational episodes called Understanding Survival, Part 1 and Part 2, where I go into a lot of depth about what survival is that I'm not going to be able to go into again here. So you're going to have to bring those insights to bear on this discussion, because we're really building on top of that. See? Survival is not just about surviving physically as a body, like I talked about in that two-part series. Survival is much more sophisticated, subtle, and elaborate than that. It's much more conceptual, especially when it comes to humans. For humans, most of our survival is social, cultural, highly conceptual. So when I say that fear is a control mechanism, a self-control mechanism that helps to maintain your identity and to keep you alive, I don't mean that it helps to keep your body alive in the very simplistic sense that, oh, well, I see a bear as I'm walking through the woods, and then I crap my pants with fear, and I run away, and that helps me to live. Of course, that's clearly a function of fear. But that's such a basic black and white function of fear that it's not even really worth discussing here. We're interested in the more sophisticated, complicated ways in which fear controls our lives in the social, cultural context in which we live. When you're going to work, when you're in a sexual, intimate relationship, when you're in a family situation, when you're dealing with religion, with politics, with government, with business, with finances. All of these subdomains of your life are permeated by fear. See? And so what the fear is doing is not just keeping your ass physically alive. The fear is maintaining your identity. And your identity, like I said in the survival series, your identity is a very specific, peculiar, unique thing to you. It's your self-image. It's what you think you are. And that self-image is variable. It varies greatly from person to person, from country to country, from era to era in human history, from culture to culture. Don't make the mistake of thinking that everyone's identity is basically the same. It's not basically the same. People have enormously different identities. So someone who identifies as being a Christian is going to have a very different set of fears and self-control mechanisms for his survival as a Christian than someone who identifies as an atheist or as a materialist scientist or as an agnostic or as a Hindu or as a Muslim. See? So what you're surviving is not just your physical body, but you're surviving, let's say in this case, the specific way in which you're being a Christian. Because when you have that identity of being a Christian, that permeates your whole life. It permeates and affects what you do on the weekends. It affects what books you read. It affects what movies you watch. It affects what people you hang out with. It affects your worldview. It affects your moral system. It affects who you're going to marry. It affects how you're going to raise your children. You see a lot of stuff. But don't make the mistake of thinking that I'm just talking about some wacky religious nutcases here. It doesn't matter if you're a scientific person. That too completely affects how you live your life. What kind of books you read, what kind of people you take seriously, what kind of videos you watch, how you educate your kids, what kind of school you send them to, what ideas you tell them about emotions versus logic. For example, a lot of materialists and atheists get this very silly idea in their mind of like, oh, facts over feelings. Emotions aren't even important because all we care about is the facts. Which, of course, even just that position itself is not factual, but emotional. So watch out. This is very tricky stuff. Fear is survival at its most basic. Fear is what gets you to avoid the stuff that will kill you. Again, not just physically, you're not just going to be avoiding fire and tall ledges and cliffs and rooftops and sharp, pointy objects. You're also going to be avoiding the stuff that will kill you psychologically, that will kill your self-image. So if you have the self-image of being a Christian, guess what you're going to fear? You're going to fear precisely those things which would destroy your Christian identity or your Muslim identity. Or if you're a scientist, you're going to fear those things which are going to destroy your scientific, materialistic, atheistic identity. And you better believe that's going to distort how you do your science. See? Because what if there is something that's true about reality, but which threatens your scientific identity? Are you going to ever find that thing that is true? Or are you going to be afraid of it because it threatens your scientific identity? You see, in this way, fear is a very important component in doing accurate science. You can't do accurate science when you're afraid. And in fact, you can't have an accurate perception of reality so long as you're afraid. And so long as you're attached to any kind of identity, you're of course afraid of that identity getting erased, dissolved, impinged upon, contradicted, shown to be fallacious. Here's a key insight for you. What you are is defined by your fears, and what you fear defines what you identify as. It's sort of a vicious circle. It goes both ways. So what do I mean by this? I mean that if you identify with being a mother or a father, that's your identity. And that comes with a certain set of fears. If you identify with having children, needing to protect them, if you identify with your family, loving your family, and that becomes part of your identity, like, oh, well, I'm part of this family, I got to protect the heritage of my family. That's your identity, and just based on that, I can tell you what you fear. How about career and business? If you're identified with your career, if you, for example, you identify with being a movie director or a successful business guy, or with being a great artist or a great composer or musician or DJ or a great author or writer or whatever, that's your identity. And a lot of your fears, I can easily predict that a lot of your fears are going to be wrapped up very tightly around that issue, because that career for you plays a huge part of your life. Maybe a whole third of your life, or maybe even half of your life is going to be devoted to that career if you're serious about it. And so, of course, you're going to have so many fears, unique fears related to that particular career or business that you run. If you identify with your possessions, like your house or your car or your boat or your private jet, and you cherish them like your pet, or like a child almost, like you collect cars, then you're gonna be afraid of losing that car collection. If you have an identity that's based around money, success, fame, or status, you're gonna be very touchy and fearful around losing money, success, fame, and status, and about being perceived as a loser or a failure, or losing your popularity. You're going to be very touchy about these things. And you're going to treat them very seriously, almost like life and death. You see, for someone who's addicted to success and fame and money and status and power, for them, the threat of losing that is worse than losing a child. See, so what I want you to understand here is that I don't want you to fall into this mistake of thinking that, well, you know, if I identify with being a physical human being and a mother and a father, that's like real, that's tangible, that's physical. Whereas if other dude identifies with his car collection or with his private yacht or with his fame and his status on Instagram or whatever, then, oh, well, that's just frivolous stuff and that's not a real identity. So his fears aren't legitimate. No, there's no such thing as legitimate versus illegitimate fear. In a sense, all fear is illegitimate. And it's all relative to whatever you identify with. If you identify with being attractive or having hair, you're going to be afraid of losing your hair. You're going to be afraid of losing your attractiveness. If you identify with being a good person, a kind, loving person who's nice and friendly all the time, you're going to be afraid of losing that, of being perceived as a bad, evil person, of being hated by others or criticized by others. And that's going to be a constant force in your life. You're going to be battling that all the time. And that's basically what we're talking about here with these fears, is that whatever you fear, you're going to be battling with that demon. It's like an inner demon that you have. You're going to be battling with it your whole life. It's not just going to be a thing that, pops up once or twice and then goes away. No. Which is why we need to go so deep on this topic, because I could just shoot a 20-minute video on how to, the 1, 2, 3 step solution for how to magically get rid of all your fear, and you would watch it, you would eat it up, but then that solution would not solve anything really, because your fears sit so much deeper than that. They're tied in with your identity. So as long as you're clinging to your identity, whatever it is, and you're not making any identity level changes, then you're never really going to solve the problem of fear. So understand how deep this goes. This is a matter of life and death. This is a matter of survival. This is not a thing that you just use a little simple technique on and then that's it, you're done, and then you go about your life all happy and peaceful and fearless. No, it doesn't work that way. Especially religious identities come with a lot of fear. How much fear is the Christian identity filled with, or the Muslim identity, or even the Buddhist identity, or the Hindu or the Jew identity? Yeah. And scientists aren't immune to it either. The scientific identity comes with fear. The rational identity comes with fear. Even the skeptic identity comes with fear. In fact, what is skepticism but fear? If you're a skeptic, the reason you're a skeptic is because you're afraid. What are you afraid of? You're afraid of being wrong. You're afraid of becoming deluded. Why are you afraid of that? Have you ever wondered? Have you ever applied skepticism to your own skepticism? You see, most skeptics, of course, never do. They're acting out skepticism unconsciously as an ideology. They're not actually questioning everything. Because if they were actually questioning everything, they would, of course, have to question their own questioning, question themselves, question whether skepticism is really, maybe it's driven by fear. Why do you trust skepticism? Why do you trust something that's driven by fear? You're afraid of being deluded. You're afraid of believing the wrong thing. You're afraid of some new age woo-woo pseudoscience. Notice that. You're afraid of that. You see? Scientists like to say, oh, well, we're rational. We just don't want to believe nonsense. We just don't like falsehood. No, that's not what's really going on. What's really going on is you have a certain identity. And you actually are afraid of being wrong, afraid of making mistakes, afraid of being deluded. But see, the problem with fear is that it tends to be self-fulfilling. So when you're afraid of being deluded, when you're afraid of believing the wrong thing, and therefore because of that you become a skeptic or a hardcore scientist, sort of a Richard Dawkins types of person I'm thinking of. If you're like that, you see, what happens there is that actually your fear fulfills itself. So your very fear of being deluded ends up making you deluded. Your very fear of dogma and religion and mysticism turns your own science and your own rationality and your own skepticism into a dogma and a religion of its own. See? If you identify with being a man or a woman, you're going to be very threatened by the opposite sex. Very threatened by the possibility of these categories of man versus woman not being just a binary, black and white, grounded in nature or biology or physics, as some people believe, but it's being more of a fluid thing where who really knows what a man or what a woman is? Maybe it's more relative than we previously believed. See, and then this, of course, freaks people out, which is why we have this whole controversy versus the LGBTQ and the transgender stuff and all this. You know, people are so freaked out by this. Understandably so, because for humans, especially for straight, kind of normal, we would say normal, especially conservative, traditional type of people, they just, they either adopt the man role or the woman role, and they think that that's just all it is. I was just born a man, I was just born a woman, that's all there is to it. But then, of course, the truth is that that's not all there is to it. And when the issue of transgender people comes up and that becomes very threatening. But then, of course, these traditional folks, they have to deny it. They have to deny it, which is why you have this problem with many conservatives, especially Christians and evangelicals, where they have latent homosexual urges and tendencies, but then they have to deny it, and then they have to project out onto the world. They have to go attack, crusade against homosexuals and gays and transgender people. But that's actually because deep down inside, they have a shadow. They made a shadow out of this. They are not willing to admit that they fear the possibility that these categories could be fluid. And therefore they have to go into denial and they have to go into attack. And they have to build up an ideology, which then, spirals out of control, creates all sorts of problems for them and for others. Research has been done on this, and they find that people who like to rant and criticize homosexuals, especially like men, for example, men who are homophobic and who have a problem with homosexuality, that these people, when they are shown images, naked images of men or erotic images of men in a sort of like clinical, psychological test type setting, they're shown just various images. And then some of those images include naked images of men or whatever, sort of erotic stuff, probably not porn, but just erotic stuff. They get turned on more than the average man who is not homophobic. Why is that? You see, of course, projection. That's why. Fear. Because if you're a Christian, you're afraid. You've been told homosexuality is so wrong that you're afraid that you might possibly be one of those evil homosexuals. And even the idea that maybe you're not even a homosexual, but even just the idea that you might once in a while have, once a month, maybe you'll have a thought about some attractive guy you saw at the gym. Just that idea alone is already such a dangerous, slippery slope that you have to reject it within your own mind, deny it, and then project it outwards onto others. And then, of course, there's the identity of just being a human. Just even thinking of yourself as a human presents many problems and fears. And just even the identity of you being real or you being a physical creature, just that identity, which you would think like, well, Leo, that's the most obvious thing. That's common across all humans. First of all, no, it's not. Second of all, you're begging the question. The question here is, are you really a human? What is a human? See, so you're saying, oh, it's common across all humans. No, it's not. You've never really bothered to wonder what a human even is, what a real being, what a being even is, what a physical creature even is. You see? And by being attached to being those things, by being attached to being physical, for example, that comes with a certain set of fears. And then, of course, people just assume that, well, yeah, sure, of course, Leo, I have all these fears, but these fears are totally natural and normal because I'm a physical being. That's just what I am. That's exactly my point. See, when you insist that you just are something because that's just what you are, and that's real, and that can't be otherwise, that's precisely your identity. That's the thing you're most attached to as your identity. Now, of course, when it comes to your identity, it's sort of like, almost like, you could think of it like the sun. The sun has various layers to it. Like, there's the outer layer of the sun, which is kind of nebulous and loose. It's like the corona, the flames shooting outwards. It's sparse, it's not very dense. But then as you go deeper into the sun, there's like further layers and cores of depth and density, and it gets denser and denser and denser and denser, and who even knows what's on the very inside, probably some super dense ball of whatever, you see. So when you insist that you really are something and that it can't be any other way, that's like, we're talking about that core, the ball at the middle of the sun. And then when we're talking about something like your identity, your attachment to your cat or to your car, that's the very edges of the sun of your identity, right? So there's like degrees of subtlety here. Certain things are easier to detach from than others. It's much easier for you to detach, for example, from your car or from your business than it is to detach from your family. And it's much easier for you to detach from your family than for you to detach from, for example, being a man or a woman. And it's even harder for you to detach from being a human than it is from a man or a woman, or from a physical being, or from being real at all. That's the hardest thing to detach from, period. So what I want you to see here is that whatever you're attached to, it doesn't matter what it is, and the reason you're attached to stuff and the reason you've built up this identity is because that's how you were born. That's how you came into this world. You could not be born without an identity of some kind. You had to construct an identity. So that's what you did as a kid and as a teenager. You were busy. You thought you were just having fun, playing video games, playing with dolls and toys. And you were just going to school, chatting with your friends and talking shit and making jokes and all this. And you thought this was just fun. This wasn't fun. This was you creating an identity for 20 fucking years without knowing what you were doing. See? And then, of course, now you say, well, that's just me. That's who I am. That's not who you are. That's who you made up yourself to be. And of course, a key component of making yourself up is that you have to lie to yourself that you made yourself up, because otherwise the game is up. Nobody wants to admit that they just made themselves up out of fucking thin air, that their whole identity is just arbitrary and it's just, we could just replace parts of you, Who wants to admit that? Well, like, yeah, I'm a scientist, but I don't really care. I could just throw that away. Tomorrow I'll be a Christian. No, it doesn't work this way. Or if you're a Christian, it's like, no, well, I don't really care, but I'm not really attached to being Christian. It's like, tomorrow I'll just be a Buddhist. And then the next day I'll just be a Muslim. And the next day I'll just be a Hindu. No, it's completely wedded to your identity, to who you think you are. So when you're a scientist or you're a Christian, you're a man or a woman, it's like, Leo, what are you even talking about? This is just me. It can't be otherwise. So see, this is what we're dealing with. So what you fear is you fear losing all of your attachments. That's what you call death, ultimately. So what is it that you ultimately fear? You fear a total loss of self. All fear boils down to a loss of self. Fear is protecting you from losing yourself. So why are you afraid to stick your hand on a hot stove? Because you're afraid it's going to hurt yourself. You're going to lose a part of yourself. You're afraid you might lose your hand. Why are you afraid of changing your career? Because you're afraid of losing that part of yourself that's attached to that career, that spent 10, 20 years building up that career. Why are you afraid of switching from being a man to a woman, or from being straight to being gay? Because you're going to lose that. And you've had that with you since you were like 3 years old. That's how early these identities form. So you don't even know what life would be like otherwise. And of course, you're afraid of what other people will think of you. And of course, you have this giant social identity that you've built up, where people now think of you as a man or a woman, or as a lawyer, or as a doctor, or as a upstanding citizen, or as a Christian, or as a Muslim. How are they going to react? And how are you going to react to their reaction when tomorrow you tell them that, hey, guys, I just decided to become gay today, or I just decided to become a woman, or I just decided to become a Muslim out of the blue. I just decided to become a scientist out of the blue. I just decided to change my career out of the blue. People will react negatively. And of course, that's going to affect your own attachment to you being perceived positively, because you've also, of course, built up an identity around that, because you want to be perceived as a good guy, not a bad guy. As someone that people look up to, not look down upon. That's what we're dealing with here. And the epitome of all fear is ultimately, or this example, this principle that I said that all fear is basically a total loss of self, fear of a total loss of self. The epitome of that is death, of course. And that's what all fear ultimately boils down to, fear of death. But not just physical death. Even more so, it boils down to psychological death, death of your self-image. So, for example, for radical Muslim, Islamist suicide bombers, the thing they fear most is not death. The thing they fear most is being bad Muslims, losing their Muslim identity. So actually, in that twisted worldview, they would rather kill themselves physically so long as they maintain in their mind the identity of being a good Muslim. That's how powerful identity is. See? And don't just think that this is just like, I'm talking about some crazy, wacko, radical people. No. This is happening across everybody. It's just, there's degrees of it. Some people go to great extremes, especially when they build up a very radical ideology. But this is fully alive and functioning within you. For example, many parents would rather sacrifice themselves. They, like, if their child was drowning, they would jump in to save their child and drown themselves. So in this case, they are more identified with being a good parent and with their child surviving than they are with their own life. See? So there's nothing radical about it, really. Most people fall under this. So this notion of a loss of sense of self is a very sophisticated one, I hope you can see. Right? We're not just talking about physical stuff. We're talking about what you identify as, and what you identify as is totally relative, and it's whatever you want it to be. Now, of course, it doesn't mean it's easy to change yourself now after you've been alive for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Now, you've gotten so calcified, your mind has become so permeated in your identity. Now it's extremely difficult to change that, of course. But that doesn't mean that this is a physical, tangible, objective fact. It just means you're extremely attached to it. You're very habituated, conditioned to it. Now, here's a key misconception about fear. And it goes like this. Well, Leo, fear is just something natural and reasonable that we all feel. And some things are just inherently scary. I mean, of course, it's natural to be afraid of death. Only natural, because we don't really know what happens after death. And it's only natural if you're a Christian to be afraid of sinning. And it's only natural if you're a scientist to be afraid of believing in some false, new agey nonsense. It's only natural. Wrong. There's nothing natural about it. All of this is being constructed by your mind. This is what you got to admit to yourself here. You're in denial about it. Fear is never an objective fact. Fear is never found out there in the world as if some object is there that is inherently fearful and it will cause fear to you. Like you see a snake and the fear is in the snake. No, the fear is not in the snake. Nor is the fear in like the homosexuality. You might say, well, Leo, I'm a Christian and, the homosexual act itself, that's a evil, and the evil is in the act, and that's where the fear comes from. No, it doesn't. Your mind is constructing the fear. It's projecting the fear out of you through the lens of your identity, you see, outwards. It's being projected out. Or if you fear something more mundane, like you fear running out of money, very common fear, you might think it's totally natural fear. In a certain sense, it is natural, but what is natural really? Is the condition of not having money, is that what fear is? No. It's how your mind is interpreting that situation that creates the fear. In fact, there are people who have millions of dollars, billionaires. There are billionaires who still fear going broke. How can that be? Obviously, it's not the condition of being poor that's causing that, because these people, they will probably die with still billions of dollars in their bank account. So they're never going to even experience poverty, but they're still afraid of it. So where's that coming from? Is it coming from all the billions of dollars they have? Is that where the fear is located? Of course not. It's their own mind constructing it. And of course, this is very easy to prove because different people react differently to different objects. So one person loves snakes, handles snakes, no problem. Another person terrified of snakes. So what does that mean? That means it's in the person, it's not in the snake. And likewise about money. There are some billionaires and millionaires who are more afraid of going broke than there are people who are like hippies and maybe only have $100 in their pocket or $1,000 in their savings account. And, they're cheerful, they're happy. They don't really care about money very much. Money's not a big deal to them. The way they were raised, they're kind of just carefree. They kind of go with the flow. They're more spontaneous. They're not worried about how to pay the bills and all that stuff. So you see, the hippie has less fear in this case than the billionaire. How can that be? Because the mind is constructing it. All fear is imaginary. Do you understand how significant this is? I'm telling you that all fear is imaginary. Think of how powerful that is, if it's true. Now, from your point of view, you don't know if that's true. The only way you can know if that's true is if you go very deep in this work and then you discover that it's true. I'm telling you that it's true, but I don't want you to just believe me on blind faith. I want you to question it. I want you to try to validate it for yourself. But what I'm telling you is that if you go study this deeply, you will discover that all fear is imaginary, including the fear of death. That's the amazing thing about fear. That's the most shocking, that's one of the most shocking, in fact, come to think of it, this is one of the most shocking insights, one of the deepest mindfucks I've ever had, and I've had plenty of them. I've had plenty of them. One of the most shocking insights I've ever had is the day that I discovered, and I remember the moment, my jaw dropped, that all fear is completely imaginary, that there's no substance to fear whatsoever. Fear is literally nothing. There's nothing there at all. Now that's powerful. Think about what that might do for your life if that wasn't just a belief that you held, but that was a living reality, that you actually became conscious of how all fear is imaginary. You think that might change your relationships? You think that might change your attitude towards work and towards health and death and war and politics and everything else? Yeah, you bet it would. Now you might wonder, but Leo, isn't it just healthy and normal to have fear? Isn't it just like a normal response? Well, it is normal in the sense that 99.9% of people are completely lost in fear. But you know what? Normality is not a sign of truth. So just because everyone around you is scared shitless all the time, just like you are, that doesn't mean that it's true. In fact, that's the kicker. That's the linchpin of this whole thing, is that all fear is falsehood. All fear is falsehood. All fear is delusion. All fear is lack of consciousness. If you were totally conscious, I'm telling you that you would not fear anything. Now, I know this is tough to believe because it seems so unlike your living experience of life. You couldn't even imagine what it would be like to live life without fear. And how could fear possibly be a falsehood? I mean, Leo, if there's like a bear in the woods and I stumble across it and I'm feeling fear, that's not falsehood. What's false about that? This is a dangerous situation. This is an objectively dangerous situation. That's false. There's no such thing as an objectively dangerous situation. Danger is relative. Relative to what? Relative to what you identify with. If you identify with being a human meatbag, yeah, bears are dangerous. The trick is that society conditions us that fear is inevitable. And that fear is totally natural and normal, and there's nothing we can do about it. Because society isn't interested in truth. It turns out that one of the remarkable things about truth with a capital T is that it transcends all fear. Because it transcends survival. So, one of the reasons you might want to pursue truth is because if you want to transcend fear. That would be one reason. In fact, that's the only way you can do it. If you want to totally do it. Now, of course, there's degrees. You can certainly work on improving your fear responses without ever fully realizing truth with a capital T. But there's a very deep connection that I want you to understand here between fear and falsehood. Fear and illusion. When you're afraid, you're trapped inside of an illusion, but the illusion feels so real that you don't know that it's an illusion, and therefore that just heightens your fear even more, and you start to believe that the fear is real. And it becomes this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy where something that isn't real actually seems like it's the most real thing that there is. That's the trick that the mind plays on you. See, mostly what society is about survival. That's what our culture and our society is built upon. That's what all social institutions are built upon. They're not built upon truth. They're not built upon understanding fear at an existential level and then transcending it. No, nobody cares about this. Society is built upon using your fears against you to help you to survive. Turn on the TV, look at the commercials. How do businesses sell you things? By going right for your fear, pushing your fear button. You know, are you worried about how fat you are and how your husband's going to leave you? Are you worried about your erectile dysfunction and how your hot girlfriend, she's going to leave you and cheat on you with another man who's more who can get it up better than you can? Well, you buy our Viagra. See? Are you worried about those illegals and Mexicans coming over the border? Vote for Trump. Are you worried about science and secularism taking over the world? Donate and support radical Wahhabist Islam who are going to fight that. Are you worried about gays? Join some Christian organization that's going to do conversion therapy on the gays to convert them to good, upstanding citizens. This is how you're controlled, through fear. Through fear. And even quote unquote sort of like good policies also control you with fear. For example, if you're kind of a spiral dynamic stage green person and you're like a hippie type and you care about the environment, well, you're afraid of the environment going bad. You're afraid of global warming. Well, that too is a fear. It's a higher quality fear. Again, there's different levels and gradations of fear. So, some fears are more delusional than others. So, for example, people who fear other races, racists in other words, ethnocentric people, traditional people, people who fear other religions. This is a pretty kind of a crude, low-level, highly delusional fear. People who fear homosexuality. This is a highly delusional fear. Now, of course, they won't agree with anything I'm saying here. They'll vehemently deny it. But yeah, it's a very crude form of fear. And then there's higher qualities of fear, like if you're afraid for global warming, there's something to that fear. It's not completely irrational. But there's also problems with fear, which we'll talk about as we keep going here. See, the trick here is that mostly humans are operating under the materialist paradigm. That's what most cultures teach us, is that we're living in a material world as physical, biological beings who were born into this material world. It's an objective world. It exists out there, independent of our perceptions. Science studies it and so forth. This whole paradigm. This plays a big role in maintaining the reality of fear. So under this paradigm, when people believe that death is real, then that fear seems legitimate and totally natural. Under this paradigm, people believe that problems are real. Like if you're out of money, people believe that's a real problem. It's a physical, tangible, material, rational problem. It's not, but it certainly seems that way under that paradigm. Or under this paradigm, people believe that it's scientific or it's rational to fear dangerous things. And that some things are just dangerous, like fire is dangerous, electricity, high voltage electricity is dangerous, wild animals are dangerous. But that's also not true. And in fact, there's nothing scientific or rational about fear. Like I was saying earlier, danger is relative to how you define yourself. See? To a Muslim suicide bomber, I should say a radical Wahhabist one, not regular Muslims, but to a very radicalized Wahhabist Muslim, to him, the greatest danger is not death. It's not a bear or a snake or running out of money. To him, the greatest danger is disappointing Allah or allowing the infidel heathens to dominate the world, allowing Islam to be eradicated to an encroaching secularism or to some other religion like Christianity or Buddhism. That's the greater danger to that person. Why? Because it's all relative. Danger is relative to how you think you are. So if you identify with being, a devout servant of Allah, there you go. And then, of course, if you identify with being a scientist, then to you, the greatest danger is religion, the delusion of religion, which threatens to endanger science and to teach creationism to children and to teach Noah's Ark and to teach children that the world is 5,000 years old. To you, that's the great danger. Now, of course, the way you rationalize it to yourself is you say, yeah, Leo, but that's objective. That's like, yeah, that's clearly delusional. And we should not be teaching creationism in school. And that's just scientific fact. Well, it is for you because you say that. Whatever you say is the fact for you because your mind is constructing everything, including all facts and all objectivity. What you call objectivity is just your subjectivity denied, projected outwards. That's all it is. There's nothing objective about your reality. It's all purely subjective. Which is precisely why you deny the subjectivity. You see, you have to deny that it's subjective because otherwise it wouldn't feel real. It would feel like a game. It would feel like an illusion. And who wants to admit that they're living in an illusion? Who wants to admit that they made up their whole life, that it's all just a lie, that it's just a story? Nobody does. Because, of course, that threatens your survival. It's scary to admit that. It's scary to admit that everything you ever believed in is just a story you invented. Very scary. Nobody wants to go there, hardly. So what I'm telling you is that all fear is predicated on falsehood and misperception of reality. You must misperceive reality in order to experience fear. Because if you, like I said, experience it in full consciousness, you can't be afraid of anything. That's a rather bold claim, but nevertheless it's true. And you can become directly conscious of that, although it will take work. You certainly won't realize that by the end of this video, or even by the next one. It'll take a lot more work than that, but you can. I've done it, you can do it. My claim here is that if you were fully conscious of what death is, you wouldn't fear it. And if you don't fear death, then you've basically conquered all fear. Now, of course, the materialist paradigm tells us that, well, nobody knows what death is. It's impossible. You're just speculating. It's just theories, Leo. You don't really know. Keep your mind open. Maybe it is possible to become conscious of what death is. Maybe, since like I told you, all fear is ultimately misperception of reality, maybe death is just a misperception of reality. Maybe death is not a physical thing. Maybe you think death is a physical thing, but that actually death is just an illusion. How about that? Think about it. But anyways, we're not gonna solve the problem of death in this episode. That'll be for another time. Let's focus more on fear. So, fear is a very practical thing. Fear cannot be understood in the abstract via a classroom lecture or a video or a book. Fear requires serious mindfulness work. You must get personally acquainted with your own fears. So when we ask the question, what is fear? Ultimately, what you have to do, bring up a fear and feel it. There it is. There it is. So let's do this right now. Think of a time where you were afraid of something. Try to find a poignant moment in your memory banks of where you were afraid of something. Doesn't matter what. Could have been a bear, a snake, or losing money or whatever. Somebody cheating on you. And just now really vividly imagine it, reimagine it, bring it back up to the point where you don't just imagine it in the abstract, but it actually starts to you get a little tinge of it. You get a little bit, it starts to affect you, almost as though you're back in that situation. Now, it's a little hard to do this because usually, once you get over a fear, it's kind of defeated, but still try to bring it up. Find something, or maybe find something that you're currently afraid of. Currently something is bothering you. Bring it up. See? And just feel that. Feel what that feels like. How does it feel in your body? Where is it located in your body? Is it in your head, in your jaw, in your chest, in your shoulders, in your arms, in your fingertips, in your knees, in your legs? Are your muscles clenched? Maybe it's in your stomach. What does that really feel like? You see, if you're doing this for the first time, it's going to be very challenging for you to pinpoint what fear is or where it resides in your body, because it's so loosey-goosey and abstract. And the reason that is because your mindfulness ability is so poor. You haven't practiced and developed that mindfulness muscle, which is the ability to objectively observe and be aware of various sensations in your body. This is why we do meditation. This is why we do mindfulness practice. This is why people do Vipassana retreats. This all develops your mindfulness ability. This is one of the most important abilities you can develop in life, is mindfulness. See? And it's only when you've been practicing mindfulness for a few years, at least, every single day, that you start to develop that ability to be able to feel your fear and your emotions for the first time, to identify these emotions. Most people can't do this, but you better start developing this ability if you want to get anywhere in this work. You will get nowhere in understanding the things I talk about without developing this ability. So begin today. I have videos on it. There are tons of other people who have videos on it on YouTube and elsewhere. There are books that have been written about it. Courses have been made. Retreats have been made. Go look it up. Go start practicing it. I have an old video called Mindfulness Meditation, where I teach you this technique. Go look at that. So this feeling of fear is as close as you can get to fear. Don't come asking me what fear is. Don't go looking in a textbook. Don't go ask your psychology professor to tell you what fear is, because fear is what is inside of you, what you're feeling when you're afraid. That's fear. Now, of course, there's a lot more to it than that. That's just the tip of the iceberg of fear. What we're interested in is understanding, why is that fear there? What brings it up? And that's a little bit more tricky. You don't often just find that directly in your experience. You have to do some sort of deduction work to figure that out. Lots of observation. But see, the problem with observing fear is that fear doesn't want to be observed. It's not like you can just be terrified of a bear who's running towards you and is about to maul your face off, and then you can just stand there and you can just say, wait a minute, let me feel this fear. Let me think about, where does this fear come from? What is fear after all? And the bear is just like charging at you and you're just standing there coolly thinking about fear. Like, no, you see? And the reason that is because fear is designed to save your fucking ass, which means that it can't give you enough time to really inspect it carefully, or to think about it, or rationalize about it and to say like, well, you know what, it's just a bear. Yeah, sure, this bear is hurling towards me. It's going to maul my face off, but is that really going to be so bad? Oh, well, if I die, what if death isn't actually so bad? Like, no, this doesn't happen. Because you don't have time for it. You got to live. Survival takes precedence over all of that. And this makes understanding fear very difficult, because what this means is that the key problem of fear is that it's a knee-jerk unconscious reaction. You're constantly reacting to fear without knowing why or what it is. See? And so to really get far in this work, what you need to do is to start to notice those moments where you are in fear. And instead of reacting unconsciously the way that you usually do, the way you have been for 20, 30, 40 years of your life, now you've got to pause, you've got to feel the fear mindfully, consciously, and now you have to wonder, okay, what is this thing? Where is it located in my body? Why is it here? Where did it come from? What function is it serving? Yada, yada, yada. That's hard to do when you're in a bind, because usually the fear only comes up when you're in a bind. You don't have fear when you're sitting there enjoying yourself, watching TV, eating a good meal. You don't have fear. You only have fear when you're in a dangerous situation, like rent is due tomorrow and your landlord is about to kick you out and you're terrified because you don't have enough money to make this month's rent. The fear seizes you, it grips you like a python. See, it starts to strangle you. And at that situation, you're going to argue with me and you say, well, Leo, but sure, you want me to just kind of sit there and analyze my fear and practice this mindfulness horseshit and act like this hippie new age person, but I got to pay my bills. How am I going to pay my bills? I need to pay my bills. It's a matter of life and death. Exactly. Exactly. That doesn't contradict what I'm saying. That is exactly what I'm saying. But nevertheless, if you want to transcend fear and outgrow your fear and start to live a life beyond fear, you're going to have to change how you react to fear. You're going to have to create a sort of a gap, a little breathing room between your fear and your reaction, and you're going to have to start to feel the fear before you react to it. And that's a very counterintuitive move, because when you're in a dangerous situation, every cell in your body is going to want to react to get you out of the danger and to minimize the fear. That's how fear works. Fear is like this thing that spikes up in you, this unpleasant feeling, this sort of jittery, unpleasant nervousness, and then you act in some way to get out of harm's way, and then it subsides, and then you're cool, and then you're glad that it's over, and you don't even want to think about it again. But see, once you're out of the fear, you can't be mindful of it anymore. That's the problem. See, when you're trying to be mindful of old fears, it doesn't work quite well. You can do it, but it doesn't really work quite well, because the whole key here is to teach yourself to be mindful of fear as it's happening to you. That's the real power. The real power is precisely the power of there being a bear hurling towards you, and you're able to stand there calmly and not let that nervousness totally dominate you and get you acting in completely unconscious ways. It's the ability to be conscious, to act consciously, to respond consciously, even when you're in grave danger. That's the real power that we're trying to develop here. Now, fortunately, you don't need to actually go and, put yourself into serious danger by confronting a bear or a shark or a snake or something like that. Most of the fears that you experience on a daily basis are relatively minor, and you can create some space. You don't need to just be constantly reacting to them. You can create some space for yourself, and you can analyze them a bit, and you can practice mindfulness on them. All right. So don't make the mistake of thinking that I'm advocating some sort of really hyper dangerous thing here. Obviously, you don't want to be practicing what I'm saying, like when you're confronted with a bear. Start with small stuff that's not going to injure you, and then you can move to bigger stuff. And then eventually you can actually get to the point where you can practice it with a bear, but That's advanced stuff that you shouldn't practice right now. Here's another key insight for you about fear. Ready for this? Fear is resistance to a future experience. Let me repeat because this is critical. Fear is resistance to a future experience. That's very powerful. This tells you how to overcome fear if you understand this key insight. That's all that fear really is. Your mind is imagining a future scenario that seems to contradict your identity and how you want to feel and who you think you are. Like, for example, if you're a Christian and I tell you that tomorrow you're going to have to abandon Christianity, burn the Bible, and become a Muslim and pray to Allah 5 times a day by facing Mecca, and that your kids are also going to have to convert, and they're going to be converted by force. You don't have a choice in this. They will be converted, you will convert all together, or you will be killed. If I tell you this, what's going to happen? Of course, your mind is going to imagine this scenario, and then, because given your identity, and you want your family and your children to all be Christians and all this, given that is true for you, based on a lifetime of being programmed with Christian beliefs, and based on a lifetime of believing that Muslims are bad and evil and wrong and unchristian and all this, and that they're going to hell. Based on that, of course, now you have a deep resistance to experiencing that. You don't want to experience being converted into a Muslim. And that's what you really fear. So fear is about refusing to experience things. Now, if you wanted to make a really bold and counterintuitive move here, you could Aikido this problem and you could say, okay, fuck it. So I'll become a Muslim. I'll enjoy it. What's wrong with being converted to being a Muslim? I'll pray to Allah. It'll be good. It'll be fun. My kids will do it. We'll get all it. It'll be great. I don't want to resist it. Let me experience what it's like to be a Muslim. Then maybe I'll turn back to a Christian later on. Maybe next year I'll be a Christian. Maybe I'll try being a Buddhist. If you took that attitude, the fear would be gone. You would eliminate the fear. But see, the problem is that's precisely the attitude that you don't want to take. You see how counterintuitive it is? Every fiber of your identity is going to be telling you, no, I can't be a Muslim. It's going to be terrible. It's going to be awful. This is going to be the end. I'm going to hell. It's going to be like my family's going to be ruined. I'm going to be an outcast, and oh my God, and I'm going to be the worst sinner. I'm going to let myself be possessed by no, Leo, no. See, that's attachment. Attachment creates fear. If you let go of your Christian identity, you'll stop fearing it. In this case, this situation. So the solution is to actually surrender yourself to the thing that you are afraid of experiencing in the future. So in this example, let's say your rent is due tomorrow, but you don't have the money. And in your mind, of course, you're imagining what's going to happen. The landlord's going to come knocking down your door. Of course, your mind is very vivid at this. Your mind paints really good pictures. He's knocking down the door and yelling at you, and he's posting eviction notices and telling you that the police are coming. They're going to kick you out and your kids. And then you're imagining in your mind that you and your children are going to be kicked out of the street. You're going to lose all your possessions. They're not going to give you enough time to take all your stuff out. You can't go live anywhere else. You don't have anywhere else to be. You're going to be living on the street. You're going to be panhandling for quarters out in the hot sun, and your daughter is going to become some whore that that sucks guys' dicks for a little bag of crack cocaine or something on the street. That's the image you have in your mind. And of course, this terrifies you because you don't want to experience that. So what's the solution? The mistake people make is they try to run away from this. The solution is very radical and it's very counterintuitive, and this is why this is advanced work. This is why this is not something that newbies are going to appreciate. The solution is to accept that. The solution is to imagine yourself on the street, begging for quarters in the sun, and to imagine your daughter sucking dicks in the back of some parking lot for crack and to be okay with that. That's the solution. And if you do that, your fear will be relieved. But of course, you're not going to do that because you're too weak and you're not wise enough to do it. That's right, you're not wise enough to do it. You're also not conscious enough to do it. You don't have enough self-control to do it because you're too afraid. You're paralyzed by your fear. Because you've built up an identity about how your daughter should be, how you should be, how much money you should have, and so on. Radical stuff, right? Radical stuff. I agree with you. It's radical stuff. This is why it's not taught. And you wonder why they don't teach this in school? This is why. The other reason they don't teach it to you in school, by the way, is because if they taught it to you, you would become invincible. See, if school taught children how fear really works from the age of 6 or even like from the age of 4, let's say when you start preschool, all the way till 18 when you graduate from high school, by that time, in those 12 or 14 years, if the curriculum was strong enough, children would be taught so well and they would master their fear so well that they would become fucking invincible, which means, of course, that you couldn't control them. And of course, society is based upon controlling you. Business, marketing, politics, it's all about control. Religion is all about control. Ego is all about control. Collective ego is all about control. It's all about survival. So of course they won't teach you this. And of course, it's not because they're nefarious and evil. It's mostly because they themselves are scared shitless and they don't know. In fact, they're scared shitless of even the idea of teaching this to you. Because then the fear comes up of like, well, Leo, but if everyone in society is fearless, what happens then? What's going to happen to business? What's going to happen to government? What's going to happen to religion? Does that mean Christianity dies out? Does that mean there's no more Islam? Does that mean there's no more wage slavery? What does that mean? Yeah, it means radical changes for society, that's for sure. It means radical changes for culture. And then, of course, everyone's attached to their culture. They don't want to change their culture. They don't want to change their language. Right? So the ultimate solution to fear is to be willing to live through the thing you fear most. And if you can do that, you'll become invincible. Of course, this is difficult to do in practice, which is why you have to practice it a lot. It goes against all of your biological urges, everything that you've been programmed with. And the way that you can start doing this is just by practicing it in your mind. Imagine that scenario and then just sort of take a deep breath and then just say, well, would it really be so bad? Is it really going to be as bad as I imagine? And of course, your mind is probably going to say, yes, it is. It's going to be so bad if I'm poor and hungry on the street. It's going to be awful. And the truth is that it probably will be awful. And the reason it's going to be awful is because you've built your entire life and all of your happiness upon conditional material possessions. So, of course, when you lose all your material possessions and all you remain with is just your consciousness and your spirituality, in practice, your spiritual development is so low and your consciousness is so low that you're literally left with nothing, less than nothing. Not the spiritual nothing. You're left with a terribly addicted materialistic mind, monkey mind, which is going to be going through withdrawal symptoms from all these material luxuries that you had and that now you lost. So, of course, it's not going to be pleasant if you're kicked out of your cushy apartment and then you have to beg for quarters on the street. It's going to be extremely painful, traumatic. You're going to suffer. You're probably going to want to kill yourself. Yeah, it's going to be terrible. That shows you the extent to which your life is built upon the wrong thing. Your life is built upon conditional happiness, buttressed by material possessions and circumstances, rather than the only thing that can generate true happiness and the only thing that can't be taken away from you, which is your consciousness, which is your spiritual development. But most people are so poorly spiritually developed that they can't practice what I'm saying here, which is why, again, this is not appropriate for newbies. Even if you wanted to, your ability to practice this will be very poor because your level of spiritual development and consciousness is so poor. So you're going to have to spend some years developing that developing your mindfulness skills, shedding certain materialistic drives and cravings that you have, having some awakening experience, some mystical experiences, some enlightenment experiences, and then you'll be able to practice this much better. But still, you can practice it. I mean, don't let me let me limit you. By all means, try it. See how far you can get. It'll work for you in small quantities. Like you can live through stuff in your own mind and just surrender to the experience of it. So maybe, for example, you're afraid of what? Let's say you're afraid of homosexual urges that you have. Let's say you're afraid of that because you want to be this masculine, macho, Arnold Schwarzenegger man type of guy that, women adore and guys look up to. And that's kind of the image of a man that you've created your identity around. That's your ideal. Well, but you also notice that, once in a while I get some homosexual tendencies. So in this case, what you can do is you can actually surrender to that. And you can say, okay, well, fuck it. Fuck it. Let me just bite this bullet and let me just accept the idea that I would have gay sex. Let me just accept it. Let me accept the idea that even if I don't go that far, let me just accept the idea that I can look at a naked image of a man and be aroused. Let me accept that. It'll be difficult, but you can accept it. I mean, it's not going to kill you to accept that, right? You can imagine it in your mind, surrender to it, accept it, and then you'll notice the fear goes away and you'll have relief. Now, of course, this is probably not going to be enough. Doing it just one time is not going to be enough because your fear is so deeply grounded. It's grounded in your identity. So unless you change your identity, the fear is going to keep coming back up, even if you let it go once or twice. So in practice, you're going to have to be returning to it. And really what's going to be required if you want to ultimately solve this problem is you're going to have to change your identity. How you identify your sexuality of being gay, straight, or whatever. And this doesn't mean necessarily that I'm not saying some ridiculous thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that now you have to become gay. I'm not trying to turn you into a gay person. All right. All I'm saying is acknowledge your cravings, acknowledge your desires. A lot more people have homosexual cravings than they would admit. Because society has told you that it's wrong to admit it, told you that it's a sin, told you that you're wrong or deviant in some way for having these. And I'm not judging. I'm not saying it's right or wrong or good or bad. It's neither of any of this. It just is what it is. The problem is when you're in denial about it. The problem is when you're afraid of it. That's the problem. Now, again, just because you surrender to this idea does not mean you actually have to go and do it. I'm not saying you have to go have gay sex or that you even have to go look at naked images of men. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying surrender to the idea of it. Stop resisting that experience. You see? Do you see how powerful this makes you? It's the opposite of what you think. Most people will say, oh, Leo, this makes me weak. This makes me feminine. No. This makes you a real fucking man. This is real strength. This is spiritual strength. The strength to accept and surrender to any experience whatsoever. This is the most powerful thing you can do, not just as a man, but also as a woman. Your inability to tolerate experience is the thing that makes you weak. To have the most power in the world, all you need to do is develop the ability to experience absolutely anything without resisting it. But see, that's a very tall order to fill. It's easy to say, it's much harder to do. In fact, most people think it's impossible to do. Not because it actually is impossible, simply because that's how much spiritual growth would be required. You see, this is the essence of spirituality. It's not about believing in God and blah, blah, blah. It's about this. It's about being so conscious that you can experience absolutely anything without flinching and without even resisting it in your mind's eye. Like if I tell you that tomorrow someone's going to cut your hand off, you're going to be like, I don't want that. That sounds terrible. That sounds terrible. And you're going to be afraid. But if you become so strong that you'll be like, well, okay, if they're going to take my hand, they're going to take my hand. And it doesn't matter because I'll still be conscious. And I can weather anything. If you take that attitude, then you won't fear it. Now, of course, again, this is very difficult to do for most people. And the reason it's difficult for most people to do is because you think that what I'm telling you here is some ideology. You think that what I'm telling you here is just like some way that you have to like psych yourself up. It's like I'm saying, okay, like I'm going to the dentist tomorrow and they're going to be drilling my tooth. And let's say I'm going to tell them not to use any Novocaine. I'm just going to be like psyching myself up. Like, come on, like, come on. I'm like beating my chest. Yeah, I can do it. I can take, I'm a man. I can take it. And then like, he's drilling my tooth and I'm like, oh yeah, the pain. Oh my God, it hurts so bad, but I'll take it. And I'm like, I'm clenching like this is not what I'm telling you. What I'm telling you is that you become so conscious that you realize that there's no pain there in the first place. You become so conscious that you realize that when your hand is cut off, that no harm was actually done to you. This is not a belief. See, you think I'm telling you that, oh, well, it's a way that I have to brainwash myself and bullshit myself into believing that no harm was actually done to me. Because, Leo, physically the harm was done. But you see, that's precisely the problem, is that you have that belief that physically harm was done to you. So you would need to surrender that belief. That's a very radical thing. You'd need to change your entire paradigm of reality. Materialism could no longer apply here. You'd have to stop identifying with being a physical body. That's not something you can will yourself to do. This is something that requires consciousness. So it's the opposite of what you think. You think what I'm telling you here is some sort of fantasies, some sort of new age wishful thinking. Actually, no, what I'm telling you is that the only way you'll be able to accomplish what I'm saying here in these very extreme examples is if you're totally aligned with truth. Totally aligned with truth. So it's not falsehood and delusion that allows you to do this. It's truth that allows you to do this. But for this, of course, you need to be conscious of what truth with a capital T is, and most of you aren't anywhere close to that. That requires a lot of work. So all of this requires a lot of work. And this is why this is so advanced. Fear is so challenging to work with precisely because it's irrational and it's relentless, and it's directly attached to your survival. Fear doesn't care about your logic. Fear doesn't care about your ideals. Fear doesn't care about your beliefs. Brute survival trumps everything else. In fact, your beliefs, your ideals, and your logic are survival at work. But fear is a much stronger survival force than logic. It's more primary. It's more fundamental. When it comes to survival, fear is like the base of the pyramid, the foundation on top of which everything else sits. And the pyramid gets smaller and smaller and less important as it goes up. And so at the top or at the higher rungs, you have stuff like logic, ideals, and other things. But at the very base of it is fear. Right? So don't be surprised when your logic doesn't touch fear. Because logic is just a tip of the iceberg. All right, we're going to do an exercise right now. I want you to pause this recording in a moment and to write down all of your biggest fears. Just make a list of all of your biggest fears. Try to be as realistic and accurate as you can. Make a concise list. Don't write out long paragraphs, just a concise list. As many biggest fears as you have personally in your life. Go. Okay, now I trust that you did that. Come on back and look at that list. That's a very helpful list. And let's talk about some of these examples. So there's a bit of a trick with fear in that a lot of times when people think about fear, they they don't think very deeply about it and very realistically about it. And they come up with very superficial, stereotypical fears, like maybe you wrote down a fear of spiders, a fear of snakes, a fear of bears and sharks, or I fear clowns, or scary movies, or I fear World War III, or global warming, or the collapse of the economy, or government taking my guns, or I fear cancer, or I fear speaking in public. These are common fears. Or maybe you fear being buried alive or poisoned, or maybe you fear having an ugly child. That's actually a fear that I get. It's so weird. But when I think about like having kids, I always get this terrible fear of like, but what will happen like if I have a kid and then he comes out, or even worse, like she comes out and she's got like 9 fingers and like 3 limbs and like 3 eyes and crooked teeth and all of this. And then like you have to love that thing as a father or as a mother, you have to love that thing. That's like a terrible situation. And see, notice the reason that that's scary is because it puts so much demand on your love. To be able to love that thing even despite all of that, like, wow, your love has to be very deep. You know, a superficial love won't be enough. It's easy to love your daughter when she's beautiful. It's a lot harder when she's an ugly troll, a hunchback or something. But what I want you to see here is that all of these fears are stereotypical and superficial. There's a much realer, deeper set of fears that we need to be talking about, which we will be in a moment. But one interesting little tangent that I want to point out to you, you know, speaking of the fear of being poisoned, this is a very interesting fear. And I was contemplating this. I don't have this fear, but Donald Trump has this fear. And I was contemplating it for a while. And, you know, I like to study Donald Trump because there's so much interesting psychological shit going on that with that basket case. But I figured it out. I figured it out why he fears being poisoned. And, you know, he talks about fear of being poisoned. That's why he actually prefers to eat fast food at McDonald's and Burger King and places, is because his rationale, and he says this on record, is that, well, you know, I can trust the fast food people that they won't poison me. Whereas if somebody prepares my meal, how can I trust them? And it got me thinking, like, that's a very odd fear to have. Why would Donald Trump fear being poisoned? Because, you know, oh, sure, he's a rich person. He's a billionaire. Supposedly, he's not really a billionaire, but that's his shtick. So supposedly he's this rich guy who, you know, yeah, maybe somebody would want to poison him. No, that's not it. There are, guess what? You know, there's a lot of millionaires and billionaires in the United States. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and all these, you know, tech giant CEOs, Elon Musk and stuff. They don't talk about fear of being poisoned. Why would Donald Trump have a fear of being poisoned? Who is the master at poisoning people? The Russians are. Of course. That's their trademark. That's how the Russian KGB operates. They're notorious for poisoning people with radioactive chemicals and things like that. People who go against them. People who cross them. What does that tell you about Donald Trump? See, he's definitely got connections with Russians. These are deep connections with high-level officials in Russia. It's quite obvious because that's the only way he was able to get financing for his businesses, because his businesses were so bankrupt and terrible that nobody in the United States, or probably even in Europe, in Western Europe, would back him. So of course he's terrified of being poisoned because of the stories that he's heard about how Russians poison people. Very interesting. It's a little aha that I had. See, when you do this work, you have these little aha moments, and then everything clicks for you and just becomes so crystal clear. This is the kind of insight that, you know, like, people in the news media, you know, they haven't had this insight. They haven't like connected the dots too deeply. Anyways, so let's keep going. So, all these fears are not that important. The more important fears are the ones that actually run your daily life. Let me give you a list of very common real active fears that run a lot of people's lives. The fear of not being good enough, the fear of failing at your career, the fear of going broke or your business collapsing, the fear of competition in your business, the fear of your spouse leaving you or your girlfriend and boyfriend breaking up with you, the fear of being alone, like not having anyone there with you at the end of your life, dying all alone, the fear of aging and losing your youth and losing your attractiveness, fear of health problems, like you have some pain in your back or you have some lump under your arm and then you have a fear of what that might mean, fear of never having sex. A lot of incels deal with this these days, or so I'm told. Fear of being embarrassed in public, fear of wasting money, fear of looking stupid, fear of other people's opinion of you, their judgment of you, fear of other people thinking that you're a bad or evil person, fear of criticism, fear of making the wrong decision. Like you're trying to buy a house and you can't decide, should I buy that one or this one? And like that one or this one, that one or this one. Fear of being wrong, fear of disappointing your spouse, children, or family. That's a very big one for people, especially for a lot of men, but also for women. Of course, women have a whole thing about pleasing their man. But a lot of times, the man gets caught in this kind of traditional role of being the breadwinner, the one who provides for his family, and then he gets really, really hung up on that. I remember I once had a client who worked 2 jobs, was killing himself. He worked 2 jobs, working 80 hours a week for 10 years straight. And then he hired me to coach him. This was some years ago when I did coaching. And we were trying to get to the bottom of what was really going on. And he was a successful guy. He wasn't working some lame job. He was like working, he had his own business. He had multiple businesses. He was trying to like do both of them at the same time. He was working his ass off. He was so stressed. He had health problems because of all these problems. And then when it got right down to it, his fear was that if he stops working both these jobs, then he's not going to be making enough money to pay for his fancy house in New York, somewhere in New Jersey or New York. He has some fancy house for his children and for his wife, and that the children would not be able to go to those super nice, expensive schools, and his wife wouldn't have that nice luxury house. And then when I told him the idea of like, well, why don't you just move to like a smaller house and then work less, but then spend more time with your children and your wife, they'll actually like you more. They'll appreciate it more, because what they want is not a fancy house. What they really want is they want more time with their husband and with their father. And in theory, he agreed with all this. And he said, yeah, that sounds right. Sounds right in theory. But in practice, he was too afraid to do it. He was so afraid to do it that we didn't even complete the coaching, because he was too busy for our coaching calls. In other words, he paid me money to coach him, a lot of money. I was charging him like $200 an hour to coach him. And in the end, he didn't even show up to our coaching calls because he was too busy working to maintain that luxurious house. Why is that? Because his identity was attached to that house and to being that provider guy who provides everything to his children, to his spouse. And I don't know what happened to him. It's probably been like 3 or 4 years now. And if I had to guess, if I was a betting man, I would bet my money that he's still doing that. Or maybe he had some terrible health problem, which would not be unreasonable, or that would be not be out of the realm of possibility. See, that's how it works. And I empathize, I empathize with that. That's difficult. When you have a fear and it's a fear that's deeply attached to your identity, it's very difficult to give that up. See, you might be sitting there and thinking like, oh, well, what an idiot this guy. He's so stupid. How could he be so stupid, Leo? Why didn't he just listen to you? Why didn't he just do it? I mean, it's so obvious this would have improved his life. Yeah, it's obvious to you, it's obvious to me, because we're not attached to his life. You see, when it's your own ass on the line, when it's your own identity that's connected to something, it becomes a lot harder. Continuing on with the list, fear of losing your faith or your religion. That's a big one for religious people. Fear of sin and fear of going to hell. That's another big one for them. Fear of being seen naked. Fear of losing your freedom. Fear of being stuck in wage slavery forever. Fear of gaining weight. Fear of giving into your cravings. These are practical, serious fears that run many people's lives. Now, these I call macro fears. These are relatively big fears that show up repeatedly throughout your life and affect a lot of your behaviors and decisions. But even more important than these macro fears are micro fears. Because these micro fears we're going to be talking about, these are so subtle and so sneaky, and they happen so consistently and so often that you don't even notice them. These macro fears, probably if you've been alive for 10, 20 years, you probably are aware of some of your macro fears. Like you might realize that you're afraid of running out of money. That might be a consistent fear you've had for a long time. Or maybe you're afraid of something like being embarrassed in public or looking stupid in public or losing your attractive looks. You're probably aware of that. But how about your micro fears? Now, what are micro fears? Micro fears I define as fears that you feel dozens of times every day. These micro fears, you experience over 100 micro fears per day without being aware of it. And these micro fears, they dominate your day-to-day life, like on a minute-to-minute basis. And then many of your thoughts are dominated by these micro fears. And then many of your habits and survival strategies are based on them. So what are some examples? I'll give you a long list. Now, watch out, because these micro fears can seem very innocent, almost trivial and superficial, and yet nevertheless, they dominate your life. So, for example, fear that you've run out of toilet paper. And I don't even mean like when you're sitting on the toilet and you've taken a dump and now you don't see any more toilet paper left. That's a rare fear. That rarely happens to you. Hopefully. If you're good about buying toilet paper. I just mean the fear of like, you might be like in the kitchen cooking a meal and then the thought comes to you like, oh shit, I'm out of toilet paper and I forgot to buy it at the grocery store. And that you're afraid. I mean, it's not a giant fear. It's not going to cripple you. It's something so small that it just completely slides under the radar. You don't even call it a fear. But nevertheless, it is a fear. And if you're good at developing your mindfulness muscle, you'll notice it as a fear. It's a micro fear. Or the fear of getting caught in a lie. We tell lies all the time at work and white lies here and there, not to hurt somebody's feelings. But sometimes you're telling a lie, but then you're afraid that, oh, well, what if my lie isn't believed? Fear of that. Fear of offending some coworker by saying something. Again, it's a little minor fear. It's not like you're terrified of it. You're not having some panic attack over it, but it's just like you're sitting there in a meeting at work. There's 10 of you guys together, and you know that you have to maintain like social cohesion there. You have to be kind of a team player, and you want to say something, but you're afraid that it might offend somebody. And you know how in the past maybe you've said something and that got you into trouble, and you don't want to be in that situation again. So that image pops into your mind. By the way, one thing I want you to notice with fear is that for you to fear, almost always there needs to be an image in your mind. That's another thing you should notice with your mindfulness muscle as you develop it. It's not just that you fear running out of toilet paper. There's actually an image in your mind of you running out of toilet paper. There's something that how it looks, and it looks bad. It looks negative. It looks painful. It looks scary. It's not just a fear of getting caught in some lie. It's like the consequences of that. Your mind plays that out, and that's very subtle. It's not necessarily a super vivid, Cinecolor movie in your mind. It's very subtle. It's almost like this faint phantom of a movie running through your mind that you need to develop enough awareness ability to spot. How about the example of being afraid of being late to work? How much do you get that? It's so common. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of reading an email. Fear of your client not liking the work that you submit to him. Fear of checking your phone. Maybe there's a text message on there that you expect, and you're just afraid to check it. Fear that the grocery store will run out of whatever item you want to go buy, like you want to go buy some steaks, and then as you get in your car, the image comes into your mind, oh no, what if they don't have steaks today? Like last week they were out of steaks. Now, is this going to like cripple you? No, but it's still a fear. It still runs you. And the problem is that these fears are so numerous. Once you start to notice them, you'll notice hundreds of them. And then, of course, it's hard to stop them because there's so many. How do you stop them all? Well, we'll discuss that in the future. Fear that some restaurant you're going to go to is going to have a long line on Friday night. You're going to have to wait for an hour to get your food. Fear that your parents will catch you jerking off. How about that one? Fear of looking someone in the eyes. Fear of that pimple that you've got on your face and that you fear it's going to look even worse tomorrow and it's going to ruin some meeting that you're going to go to. Fear of losing your car keys, or fear that you have lost them already. Fear that you might have caught a cold. Do you get that one? I get that one quite a bit. Sometimes I feel like some cold is coming on, but I'm not even sure if it really is a cold or what, if I'm just kind of feeling a little bit bad. Maybe I'm getting a little bit of sore throat, but I don't even know if that's because I was just talking too much or just because I actually am getting a cold. And I'm kind of like afraid of like, oh no, I got a cold. That's going to take a whole week. It's going to ruin my videos, blah, 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 right? So, and then that's the image that I run in my mind. Fear of talking to your boss. Fear that your breath smells. Fear that you have something stuck in your teeth. Fear of being pregnant after sex. Fear of the store closing before you get there. How often do we get that one? Fear of cleaning your garage. Fear of doing your taxes. Fear over paying your rent. Fear of confronting a person. Fear of telling your parents the truth about something. Fear of giving your honest opinion. Fear of skipping the gym. You gym rats? I know you have that one. I used to have that one a lot when I went to the gym a lot. Fear of going to the doctor. Maybe you're feeling some ache in your tooth or in your back or somewhere, and you know you should go get it checked out, but you're afraid of like, what if it's something serious? What if it's cancer? What if it's this? What if it's that? Fear of making a mistake at work. Fear that this meeting that you're going to won't turn out well. Fear that you forgot something like your homework or some important task you were supposed to do. Or fear that you went to the grocery store, but then you forgot the thing you needed most. Fear that someone hasn't texted you back. You know, sometimes you text someone, like maybe you're a parent texting your kids, but your kids don't text you back, and you're like afraid, what happened to them? Did they get kidnapped? Are they okay? Are they drinking? Are they doing drugs? What are they doing? Fear that you'll never find your life purpose. Fear that you'll have to work overtime this week when you don't want to. Fear that someone is judging you. Fear that your coworker is talking and plotting against you behind your back. Fear that your company might fire you. Fear that you'll incur some credit card fee. Fear over starting a new project. Fear of calling someone on the phone. Fear of checking your bank account. Fear that you missed a great opportunity. Fear that you'll break a good habit, like you've been meditating consistently all year, but then even though you are meditating consistently, notice that yes, it's good that you've been meditating consistently, you haven't missed a single day, but also notice that you're afraid every single day that you will miss the next day. Notice that. Fear of someone yelling at you. And then creative anxiety. Creative anxiety is a whole category, whole can of worms we can't get into here, but it's very, very common if you do any kind of creative work. Whether you're a writer, musician, a director, a designer, an engineer, creative anxiety is a bitch. And I get it quite a bit because I'm very creative, but also I get it. So these are micro fears. These are fears you usually get on a kind of a daily basis that fly under the radar that you've never even thought about before until I mentioned it to you. Again, this is just the tip of the iceberg of this list. You're going to have to figure out what this looks like actually in your life. I want you to become much more attuned to when you are in fear. So here are some action steps from this episode. Number 1, start to notice micro fears. Number 2, start to observe how fear shapes your behavior. Number 3, start to observe how fear affects your thinking. These micro fears are not just in your actions, they're in your thoughts. And start to feel them rather than just reacting from them. Another important point about fear is that fear isn't just held in the mind. Fear is held as tension in your body. Your body stores decades of fear in it. And fear leads to not only psychological problems, but to physiological problems, such as panic attacks, anxiety, sweaty palms, sweaty armpits, sweaty clothes, heart attacks, strokes, nervous breakdowns, sexual problems, erectile dysfunctional problems, libido problems, addictions like overeating, drinking, substance abuses of various kinds, weed, and so forth, mental illnesses, obesity, insomnia, certain kinds of cancer. Of course, not all cancer, nor am I saying that all heart attacks are caused by fear per se. Of course, there are many factors. Your nutrition is important and so forth. But I'm saying that these can be caused by fear. Reduced lifespan overall, headaches, chronic fatigue, exhaustion, burnout, stress hormone imbalances, which are very common, cortisol hormone problems, thyroid problems, and so forth. These can be fear-related, stress-related. High blood pressure, back pain, neck pain, muscle twitching. Sometimes, some muscles twitching in your eye or whatever. Stomach aches, irritable bowel syndrome, diarrhea, constipation, ulcers, nail biting, fidgeting, pacing back and forth. These sorts of nervous tics. A weak immune system overall, frequent colds and flus, PTSD, trauma, depression, menstrual problems, skin rashes, psoriasis, eczema, acne, personality disorders, even suicide, and various kinds of violent radical ideologies are all often caused by fear. And then there's a host of softer problems, more nebulous problems caused by fear, such as racism, closed-mindedness, defensiveness, bad decision-making, bad science, even. Irrational laws which are passed based on fear. After a terrorist attack, a lot of bad laws get passed. Why? Precisely because it's a knee-jerk reaction, not a proper conscious response to the situation. We can attack the wrong country, we can bomb somebody, we can pass some sort of racist law, some Islamophobic law or whatever, all because we're afraid collectively. See, fear, of course, doesn't just happen at an individual level. Fear in humans happens at a collective level. Entire societies or corporations or organizations or governments can be caught in fear. Now, I've told you before that the whole point of life is to, one way to think about what life is all about is that life is a love simulator. I've told you that in my episodes about love. And another way to frame that is that life is about learning how not to fear. These are just the inverse of each other. Fear and love are inverse. So to say that life is a love simulator, what that means is that life is going to present you with fear over and over and over again so that you can learn how to love it and therefore transcend it. See? And life is such a big thing that it presents you with some very scary things to love, which is precisely what grows your love. How is fear overcome, you might wonder? Ultimately through consciousness. That's the key. Not by necessarily avoiding the fear, but by realizing that the fear is an illusion. That's the key to a permanent root solution to fear. Most of the times when people solve fear in their life, they don't do it through consciousness. They don't do it by realizing that it's an illusion. What they do instead is they react against the fear and they avoid it through denial or manipulation, or usually a combination of both. And then they treat that as success. Because, if the fear is out of your mind, it seems like you've solved it. If the fear is denied, it seems like you've solved it. Or if the fear is something that you manipulate your way out of, it seems like you've solved it. So, for example, you might fear paying your rent. But then in the last minute, you earn some money somehow, and you've paid your rent, and like, phew, okay, I've done it. The fear is gone. But what you've done there is you haven't actually conquered or transcended that fear. What you've done is you've manipulated your way out of it. And yes, it worked. But then what this means is that the next time it comes up, you'll be in the exact same place. You haven't actually grown yourself to be a bigger person to not fear that situation anymore. That would be real growth. Real growth in that situation would be like you faced it so deeply that when it happens to you again, you won't react the same way that you usually do. But if all you did is just pay it off with some money, that didn't actually grow you. And so it seems like you've solved your fear, but actually you haven't. Because you haven't seen that it's an illusion. Now, of course, you might wonder, well, Leo, but how is not paying my rent an illusion? They're going to kick me out of my house. That's true. They will kick you out of your house eventually. But the illusion is that this is a terrible thing. And you might say, well, but it is a terrible thing. Well, again, the illusion is that you think it's an objectively terrible thing, whereas really it's something your mind is constructing to be a terrible thing. See? That's something you have to work through on your own. The thing you have to understand about fear is that when you're stuck on a fear, it's going to be very difficult for you to understand how the fear is an illusion. Precisely because if you could easily see how it's an illusion, you wouldn't be afraid of it. So if you're really afraid of something, you're going to be deeply in denial that it's an illusion. You're going to feel like it's real. And you're not going to understand how it's unreal. That's going to take some work. It might take you years of work to finally crack that nut and to see like, oh yeah, I see now how it was an illusion. So don't let that throw you off. You're not necessarily going to understand how all of it is an illusion right now. So if you really want a permanent fix for fear, and you really want to use fear to grow yourself, and you want to play up this whole idea that life is a love simulator, then what you got to do is you got to do the counterintuitive move here and to confront your fear. Avoidance of fear brings stagnation and a victim mentality. That's one of the worst things about running away from your fears, is that the more you do it, the more you feel stuck, depressed, and the more it hurts your self-esteem. Because everything terrifies you now. You can get to the point where you're so terrified you don't even want to leave your house. There actually are people like this who are too scared to leave their house. See? And they become total victims. And the reason it's so tricky is because it's not like you're just fine, you just are that way one day. It's like you gradually build up to it over years and years and years and years of avoiding fear, of denying fear, until you become such a victim that you're completely stuck and hopeless. So be careful about that. There's a condition known as learned helplessness, where this can happen to you. But if you confront your fear, then it grows you. And it also brings instant relief. It's not even necessary that you fully solve the actual physical problem. Like, let's say you owe somebody some money, and you might think, well, if I just give them the money, that's what's going to solve the problem. And that's what will bring relief. Actually, the relief will be brought even sooner if you just surrender yourself to that experience, like we talked about earlier, and you stop resisting it, and you actually confront the fear head on, that will bring immediate relief to the point that you don't even need to wait to pay the money off. The relief will come to you now, as soon as you confront the problem. Like, for example, if you're stuck in a bad, abusive relationship as a woman, and you have a lot of fear about leaving this relationship because, you like this guy, he's almost perfect, he's so nice, and so he's so good most of the time, but, occasionally when he drinks, he gets abusive with me. But, if not for that, then he would be perfect. You have this kind of fantasy in your mind, common fantasy. And so really, that you need to leave this relationship, but you're in denial about it because you're afraid. You don't want to leave. You don't want to be alone and all that. And so by not leaving, you start to get more and more stuck. You see, by building up that fear of leaving this relationship, like you start to imagine how bad it's going to get, how alone you're going to be, how much you're going to regret leaving him, and blah, 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 and how mad he's going to be, and how sad he's going to be, and all this stuff. And with all those images, you get yourself stuck more and more and more, and your self-esteem drops lower and lower and lower. Whereas if you confront the worst of it and you bite the bullet and you say, fuck it, you know what, I'm going to leave. Yes, it's going to be painful for a while. Yes, I'm going to be alone. Yes, he's going to be sad too. And yes, it's going to be bad for a few weeks. But fuck it. Let me just go through this whole experience. I surrender to the experience. Let me just go through it. Immediately, you'll get relief. You don't even need to walk out the door yet. You will get relief before you've even walked out the door. That will build confidence for you, and then that will actually help you to deal with the situation in the best way possible. Avoidance of fear can become extremely pathological, resulting in all sorts of twisted addictions, lying, criminal schemes, dirty politics, abuse, various kinds of parasitic behavior, ideologies, and devilry of all sorts come from avoiding fear. Fear of ultimately facing yourself, facing your own weaknesses. See, that's often what we're afraid of, really. We're afraid of stepping up to the ball. We're afraid of going big. We're afraid of being bold. We're afraid of being decisive. We're afraid of putting ourselves in a situation where we have to work hard, where we have to be creative, where we have to be innovative, where we have to be courageous, where we have to be our best selves. That's what we're really afraid of. And a lot of people, rather than doing that, what they do is they take a shortcut, and instead they resort to addiction, lying, criminal schemes, abuse, parasitic behavior, ideology, and devilry, because they don't really want to face their own greatness. How twisted is that? It's amazing how twisted consciousness can get. The problem with always manipulating your way out of fear is that you're still limited by your manipulation skills. And even if your manipulation skills are very good, it's still not going to be a root solution, because ultimately you cannot manipulate your way out of death. So, for example, Donald Trump is an excellent manipulator. He's really good at lying and cheating and stealing and swindling and scheming and various kinds of con artistry and all this. He's great at it. A master. He could teach a master class in it. And on the surface, it might seem like, well, Leo, what's wrong? I mean, he's got lots of money. He's got a beautiful wife. He's got nice kids. He's got he became president. He's got all this prestige and all this. What's wrong with it? Well, what's wrong with it, number one, is that he's still constantly in fear. No matter how good of a manipulator he is, it's never going to be enough. Number two is that his manipulations oftentimes fail. They don't always work. And when they don't work, that causes a lot of suffering and problems. And then number three is that in the end, the most important things you can't manipulate your way out of. You can't manipulate your way into love and into truth, and you certainly can't manipulate your way out of death. You're going to have to face it. See? So That's going to be very painful in the long run. In the short term, it works. And then even in the short term, it can fail. See, fear tends to be a poor survival strategy for anything that isn't like immediate and physical. So if you're facing a bear in the woods, in that scenario, fear is fine. It's a healthy response to that situation, and it's actually very effective. You see the bear, and you just haul ass because you're full of cortisol or whatever hormone, you're going through that flight or fight response, and you just flee. Great. It works. But human society and human life is much more complicated than just bears in the woods. That worked for our ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago, but we're way more evolved than that today. We're dealing with much more complicated systems today, in which fear tends to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is the whole law of attraction deal. If you are constantly afraid, you're going to tend to attract the thing you're afraid of. How does this work? Well, let me give you a few examples. For example, fear of your girlfriend or boyfriend cheating on you. This is a common fear that people have. But what they don't realize is that that fear itself tends to fulfill itself. So if you're afraid that your boyfriend is going to cheat on you because you've gained some weight, let's say you're a woman, then that fear makes you clingy and makes you constantly kind of like begging your boyfriend to be with you more and more, and it makes you paranoid, so you start to check his phone, and then he catches you checking his phone, and then he's like, why are you checking my phone? Like, what's going on? And then you have to lie to him and all that. And see, all of this ultimately gets him to lose his attraction for you, because he looks at you, he's like, why is she so needy? She's so needy all the time. She doesn't trust me to go out with my friends. She doesn't let me go out at night. She's too controlling and all of this. And then he does leave you. Or for example, fear of your business failing. You're so terrified of losing your business that you spend so much time worrying about losing your business that you don't focus enough on your business and being creative and being innovative and doing good work. And the best way to be creative is not from fear. It's hard to be creative when you're fearful. The most creative you can be is when you're relaxed, and fear is the opposite of relaxation. So when you're preoccupied with anxiety and fear, you can't be very creative, and therefore you can't create good business solutions, and then therefore your business fails. How about the one of fear of immigrants, foreigners, and Muslims? This is a common one in the news today. A lot of people, traditional folk, are fearful of the browning of America and all this. Yeah, that's a legitimate fear that people have. But that fear becomes self-fulfilling, because when you fear, for example, black people or brown people, then when you see brown people or black people, your mind, through confirmation bias, tends to only look at news where brown people and black people did something wrong. And so, of course, every time you check the newspaper, you see, oh, look, that black person killed somebody. Oh, look, this brown person robbed a store. Oh, look, these immigrants here are drug dealers. Oh, look at this. And then you get this idea in your mind that all immigrants and brown people and black people are bad. And then, of course, that tends to make the problem worse, because when you're afraid of Muslims, you don't understand Muslims properly. You don't have proper relations with Muslim countries. And then those Muslim countries might attack you in the future, or there might be some rogue elements in those countries. There's a culture war between the Christians and the radical Muslims, or whatever, the evangelicals and the Wahhabis. And then from that can come terrorist attacks and violence and all sorts of things. And then each side will use that as justification for see, we knew that those people were dangerous. Now, of course, sometimes people just are dangerous too. That's also okay. I'm not saying that danger is always in your head. Like sometimes, relatively speaking, something is dangerous. Like a knife, relatively speaking, is a dangerous object compared to a teddy bear. See? So, some things are just more dangerous. So do take that into account. Don't don't assume that what I'm giving you here is some naive Pollyanna-ish view of the world. There are real dangers in the world relative to you wanting to survive as a human being. Understand that. So fear is good when you're just looking out for your bare physical survival, but this is sort of a short-term survival strategy. Fear is a terrible long-term survival strategy because it keeps you running in a loop. Fear is a negative emotion, and so therefore, by acting on your fear, you never fully resolve the fear. You're always going to be coming back to it over and over and over and over and over again. And it creates a yo-yo effect because negative motivation, they never get you out of the problem. They just solve the problem for a short term until the fear goes away, then you fall right back into it. So for example, if you're afraid of being fat, what happens is you get a gym membership, you go to the gym, you work out for a few weeks, you lose a few pounds, now you look a little bit better, now your fear goes away, now you're not afraid of being fat anymore, now you go pig out on a bunch of ice cream at the restaurant, and now a few weeks later you find yourself fat again, and now you're afraid again, and now you go back to the gym, and then you work out for a few weeks, lose all that weight that you gained, and then of course you look better again, you look your normal self, you stand on the scale, you're at your normal weight, the way you think you should be, the weight you're attached to, the weight your identity is attached to. And then of course you go out with your friends the next weekend and then you pig out on some barbecue ribs. And then of course the problem repeats itself and you're just in this yo-yo cycle all the time and you never resolve anything. That's what fear does. That's what negative motivation does. So fear is not good if you're interested in happiness and thriving in life. Fear is good for just like basic subsistence. You're just scraping by. It's not a very pleasant way to live. There's going to be a lot of suffering with that. Fear also tends to be unhealthy in the long term. Fear is good for maintaining the status quo, but fear is bad for growing to new higher levels and reaching great achievements. A lot of government status quo is maintained due to fear. But if we want to really build an amazing new government, a much better government that works much better, we need to be able to let go beyond the fear and to dream big and to make significant changes to our government. You know, like when Martin Luther King said, I have a dream that one day, you know, white children and black children will go together into school, whatever he said. I don't remember what he said exactly. Something along those lines. We'll be able to like live together in happiness and peace. That was a radical thing. He was challenging the status quo. See, he wasn't saying that from fear. But the people who were opposing that, the people who wanted segregation in the South and so forth, back in the 1960s in America, they were afraid. They were afraid of like, oh my God, what happens if we desegregate schools and black children and white children are drinking out of the same fountains? The drinking fountains are going to be, you know, corrupted by the black people. Oh my God, it's terrible. Fear. You see, you can't build a great society on fear. It has to be built on vision and on love and on higher things. All right, that's enough for part one, but don't go anywhere. Hold on. I have a big homework assignment for you. There's a lot of homework here this week that I want you to do so that you can really get the full benefit of part two, which is coming next week. So, first, your assignment is this: observe your micro fears every single day for the next 7 days. As much as you can. At the end of each day, so you'll do this 7 times, you will write out as many of your micro fears as you can. So during the day, you'll just observe them, but then at the very end of the day, before you go to bed, you're going to write out a list of them for that day, whatever they were, just so that you're clear on what they are. And you're going to do that every single day for 7 days, and then you can compare all the lists and see, you know, what are the common overlaps. Then you're going to contemplate the following question. How are these micro fears related to my identity? How are these micro fears related to my identity? I want you to draw that connection. These micro fears are not just random things that accost you. They are stemming from your identity. How is my mind projecting these things into the world? How am I creating these micro fears? This is where you have to take radical responsibility of your emotions and your fear. It's not something that just happens to you. It's something you're doing but you don't know how or why you're doing it. That's the key when you're working with emotions, is to take that attitude of responsibility. Next, I want you to observe how your thoughts are shaped by fear. Next, I want you to flesh out your list of biggest fears that I had you start earlier in this episode. So these are the macro fears. Start to flesh out that list. You want to become very acquainted with your biggest macro fears. What are they, and how do they shape your thoughts and your actions? And how do they stem from your identity? And then I want you to contemplate the following question: what am I unwilling to experience? What am I unwilling to experience? Because that question is the key question that unearths all your fears. All right, that's it for part one. Make sure you stay tuned for part two. In part two, here's what you're going to get. You're going to get a lot of answers to frequently asked questions and objections, which we didn't have time to really get into here. I'm going to give you my top 10 tools for overcoming fear. And I'm going to answer the question, what is the most important quality you need to succeed at life? So make sure you stick around.